Well, good morning. It's time for our pastor's study, and we're in a series on the Benedict option. We're reading several books as Disciple Center. One of them is the Benedict option. We're reading two additional books to be supplemental to that. One is Strangers in a Strange Land by the Archbishop of Philadelphia. The other one is Out of the Ashes. Now, these each take somewhat different perspectives on what is going on in our culture and the impact it's going to have on religious communities. The primary text, though, that we're using is the Benedict option. And in the fifth and sixth chapters, today we're going to look at the fifth chapter. In the fifth chapter of the Benedict option, uh, there is a rethinking of the church and of the household. Now, the order in the book is the church and then the home, really the community. I want to emphasize that that order is not correct. The congregation and the religious community are dependent on the home. Bad homes will not reinforce health in a community of faith. But gathered, mature homes will create a community that thrives. And so we need to keep that in mind. But I'm going to follow the order that he uses in the book. Chapter 5 is really a critique of the American church. And I believe it's a fair and fairly accurate one. The churches have significantly changed from the earliest part of the 20th century to the early part of the 21st century. And several things have brought this about. He talks about them. I want to give my own perspective here to supplement what he says. The parachurch movements of the 1940s to the 1960s really attempted to be evangelical arms of the church. They would be the arms of the church that would reach out to specific groups, minister to them, and bring them back into the church. And this was done in the military with groups like Navigators, and college students with Campus Crusade, and high school students with Youth for Christ, and drug users with Teen Challenge. Very, very significant movements of parachurch ministries reaching out beyond the church, trying to reach the unchurched with the gospel and bring them back into the church to be discipled and go through spiritual formation. Now, two things hindered this strategy. The first was that the organizations began themselves to become kind of mini churches for the workers, particularly, and primary converts, so that many of the new believers were just not catechized in the faith. They were just trained to be evangelists and to keep going. And that model has really become a standard model. Now, I'm aware of this because I was involved in Youth for Christ, Teen Challenge, and Campus Crusade, primarily Youth for Christ, but the other ones as well. And so I watched this and participated in it. Second, the churches were devastated by several movements that would cause them to have to rethink themselves, and they would have to reform themselves so that they became little competing parachurch-like entities, so that what used to be communities of faith in multi-generational contexts began to be more churches that had a specific group they were trying to reach. And there were certain movements then that began to affect the churches and I think create problems. One of those was the youth movement of the baby boomers. I was part of that. We were anti-establishment. We didn't like any establishment, and that included the church. So there was already an attitude that the church is probably not going to be helpful. After all, it's boring, it's old, it's historic. Who needs that? And the boomers were becoming tied to their own media. TV and radio and movies were focusing on youth as a marketing group, and we were the first generation. The war generation had their own soundtrack with the big bands, but we had transistor radios and we could listen to only our music, not have to listen to the other thing or trust anybody over 30. The youth movement was creating a push towards a new worldview that would eventually become the postmodern one. And idealistic young people became hippies and counterculture, tune in, turn on, drop out. There was this movement just away. We'll just go back to nature and we'll just go different. We don't need the nations. We don't need the establishments. Now, among young Christians and the parachurch ministries trying to reach them came a new kind of Christian revival, the Jesus movement. And the Jesus movement gave all kinds of rise to new kinds of congregations and house churches. We thought we invented the house church in there, but the reality was that we no longer needed church history. We had the first century, and now we, the Jesus movement, the new young Christian, we were identical to that early movement. And so who needed the historical church? We were the same as the disciples. And so contemporary music and Bible translations began to happen, and there was a push towards radical individualism, which lessened the need for organized religion and for passing down the tradition. Added to this, Pentecostalism permeated the churches through the charismatic movement and placed God in the individual and the individual front and center. God now spoke directly to the individual who needs the Bible other than as an additional reference, but God speaks to us directly. And my relationship with Jesus becomes the most important thing, more important than our relationship with God. And so the church responded to this movement because churches were being emptied. The church responded by creating youth and children's ministries, bus ministries, youth ministries, marriage ministries. And the church, in a sense, became the churches, the local churches, became parachurches. They became ministries. They became focused primarily on reaching the lost, evangelism. Discipleship took a backseat. Worship now had to be meaning. Even worship had to be meaningful to these young people and to seekers. And so the idea was that we would alter worship so that it was more relevant to the average non-believer. So worship ultimately became entertainment, and preaching became stand-up comedy and pithy self-help psychology. And we see that happening. And in the context of that, tradition was lost. Now, the author of the Benedict option gives us 5 things that he believes the church needs to return to. I'm going to talk about each one of those briefly, and hopefully that will help you with this chapter of the book. He begins with the idea of liturgy. The gathering of God's people has always been liturgical. Liturgy involves an order, an approach. Holy people in holy space and holy clothing, engaging in worship, approaching God through patterned rituals in prescribed times. Following God as a way of life, which has a religious calendar, which has a life cycle, which has a manner of living through commandments and covenants, guided experiences of truth by being doers of the word. So this text and tradition that's found in Judaism and Christianity historically bear witness to this. Now, the problem was we went from a religion to now I have a relationship. Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship. Now that's cute, but it sometimes is meaningless. A lot of us have relationships that have no effect on our lives. The reality is there is religion in the faith. And that religion, true religion, James says, is to be holy and to be righteous. And that's really what the commandments are about. That got lost in the separation of gospel evangelism from discipleship and reduced salvation to simply believing. So liturgy needs to return to the church. We need to get back to the religious calendar, to the holy days, to the rituals of the life cycle, to all of those kinds of things. They are, if you will, the process of the pathway that we walk as believers, not to become believers, not to become saved, but as saved people, we have a life, a way of life that is important. The second thing he talks about is asceticism. While discussing fasting primarily, the author is really addressing spiritual disciplines. These include devotional reading and study of the scriptures, prayer and practicing the presence of God, Fasting, which is a form of self-denial, denying the appetites, so that we can deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow the Lord, so we can be less about ourselves and more about others. And then obedience, which is implementing the commandments of God as a lifestyle and a stewardship of our time, our giftedness, our resources, and our relationships. This is really important. There is a discipline to the Christian life or to the Jewish life that is lost in this kind of what I call hometown buffet Christianity. I believe what I want. I don't want that. I do want that. I like that ritual. I don't like that ritual. This kind of self-created faith instead of a shared communal faith. Now, related to that, he says that one of our problems is church discipline. Congregational commitment through covenant and stability includes accountability to one another. We don't just belong to God, we belong to one another. We're not just members of Christ, we're members of one another. And in that context, we are to submit ourselves, entrust ourselves to one another in the Lord. That requires an accountability. And that involves some level of church discipline. Now, the historical Baptist approach to this is that each congregation draws up its own covenant, a congregational covenant of lifestyle and obedience and understanding of the scriptures. And people join that and agree that they're going to live in that kind of a context together. At the Disciple Center, we have a covenant that we do together. We renew it every year at Pentecost. And it's an agreement to live as a community of faith, subject to one another in the fear of the Lord, following the scriptures as the congregation understands it, drawing on all the traditions of Judaism and Christianity to inform us about that tradition. Church discipline is not about being harsh and punitive. It's about restoring the relationships, keeping the unity of the faith in the bond of love and peace in that sense. Then evangelism. He talks about evangelism as living truth in such a way that God's wisdom and character that comes out of living that truth is attractive to people. And then we're able to give an answer for the reason for the hope that is in us. In other words, instead of this salesman kind of Christianity or this manipulation Christianity for evangelism, we live the faith as salt and light. And people go, why are you living your life this way versus this way? Now they have to see the difference, and they have to see the difference as having some benefit or of being really a problem. And that opens them up to us being able to give a reason or an answer for why we live the way we live. That approach to evangelism, both for our children, when your son asks you, why do you do these things? Then you will tell him. So it's done with the children, and it's done with potential converts as well. That's not done in the congregation. That's done by the congregation out in the marketplace and in the world. And then he says we have to maintain an exile mindset. This is really the diaspora perspective. We need to understand that we're not of this world. We belong to the kingdom. We live by kingdom standards. We don't necessarily belong to this culture. And as a result, we may be subject to abuse and persecution for his namesake. And that may mean, according to the author of the Benedict option, even the possibility of martyrdom. Now, there are martyrs who suffer for the Lord and martyrs who die for the Lord. The church has historically separated those two types, but they both are about persecution against those who live righteous. Those who live righteous will suffer persecution. Jesus says that when that happens, rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. So this biblical approach to living is about having a congregation that's not primarily the sales and distribution of the gospel, but the community of faith in which the gospel is lived and therefore is attractive to others, or a stench of death to others, either way, bringing them to focus on the scriptures and on the community of faith. So that's an important part, and I believe that our churches have really become simply self-perpetuating organizations that do whatever the latest fad is to just get, as Whoopi Goldberg says, butts in the seats. Butts in the seats is not evangelism. Butts in the seats is not discipleship. Butts in the seats and money in the offering is simply a way for the church to become a business. And we're not about business, we're about the kingdom of God. So next time we're going to look at the community relationships and dynamics, and particularly that which sits in our homes. We're going to look at the home and the family as we look at the next chapter. So I hope that helps you with chapter 5, and if you have any questions, be sure to let me know about them. We'll see you later.